Hey, Sunay. So I just watched this HBO documentary, Money Electric, The Bitcoin Mystery. They're saying this guy, Peter Todd, might be Satoshi Nakamoto. So I'm really interested in kind of the ethical implications of crypto in general, but I think we need to understand what crypto is.
Yeah, let's do it, man. It was a super interesting movie and lots to unpack. And no doubt, I mean, the whole world of crypto is super fascinating. So yeah, look forward to jumping in.
Yeah. So let's jump into it. So this documentary, it's suggesting that this guy, Peter Todd, who's a Canadian developer, could be the elusive Satoshi Nakamoto. So let's back up for a second. So Satoshi Nakamoto was, according to this documentary, it was a white paper written by someone named Satoshi Nakamoto that launched Bitcoin, right? And this was back in the mid 2010, something like that. And supposedly no one knows, it's a mystery figure. No one knows who this guy is. And this documentary was kind of put together to try to uncover his, not only to uncover his identity, but, just to go through the whole crypto trend and what even is crypto. And I found it all super interesting. So what's your take? What's your take on this guy, Peter Todd and Satoshi Nakamoto?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely want to get into the whole idea behind cryptocurrency, why they emerged, like why it took so long for them to kind of take off from the early days, and just how kind of almost insightful the concept and the concept of Satoshi Nakamoto, but then how the creators of Bitcoin even envisioned this proliferation of a cryptocurrency across the globe, and even had the foresight, from my perspective, answering your question, of creating this fictional character, Satoshi Nakamoto, to protect the identity of the very folks that created the Bitcoin. It's very interesting that the creators of Bitcoin had the foresight of this potentially becoming a multi-billion dollar creation. Let alone, I can't imagine they ever imagined that they ever considered it becoming a multi-trillion dollar
Yeah.
product that they essentially created out of thin air. The concept is very unique compared to other crypto coins that have been created out there, and the biggest one, of course, that there's 21 million coins that can be mined through an algorithm that matches the string of tokens associated with a given hashed string of numbers and characters. But all that being said, my view is that there's probably two, three, maybe even four folks that were involved in the drafting of the white paper that you mentioned, as well as the code to create Bitcoin and all the marketing that then went into creating the hype around Bitcoin and ultimately to where it is today. And I think those creators are multi billionaires. And I think that there is no real Satoshi Nakamoto. I think it was all created as a way to protect the real folks that created Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think it definitely comes across as this was definitely a group effort, right? Like it doesn't, while it's possible, I don't think it's the work of one genius that, put this together. And it seems very much like it would have been a group effort. And all these kind of cryptographers that they talk to in the documentary, it's interesting because when they were being interviewed, it's almost like this wink wink thing what they have with each other when they're in the scenes together, where it's like they have this inside joke or inside secret that they're not sharing, but it almost feels like there's something there, and it was really an interesting dynamic.
They said multiple times in the documentary that we are all, that every one of us, every human is Satoshi Nakamoto. Like, it did seem like, I agree, that they had this running joke of just making the hunt for Satoshi Nakamoto so elusive yet so interesting that it's hand waving. It's so that folks are going to continue down this impossible mission, keeping the focus off of the actual folks that whose lives could be threatened. I mean, governments have. I mean, they open the documentary with an example of the FBI shutting down a competitive cryptocurrency because of its threat to the U.S. economy. I mean, maybe there's some sensationalism there, right? But the
Yeah.
threat to the global economy is very real, like, and especially the uncertainty of what is really, you know, creating value within this entity that millions of people have now invested money into, and now it has a over $1 trillion market cap. I mean, literally a fiat currency through hype and narrative and the objective scarcity. Out of thin air, you've created value, like literally digital value off of this currency. And I mean, obviously, so many other currencies have followed, but I think it continues to just be a game of, distraction with this Satoshi Nakamoto.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, let's move away from the Satoshi Nakamoto thing for a second, and let's kind of talk about the basics of Bitcoin for people that might not know, right? So, the theory is that because currency currently is controlled by governments and large banks, that they can use it as a tool for surveillance and for, I don't know, just controlling the populace, right? And the idea behind Bitcoin, the very high level idea, and I'm going to play dumb, which is code for I really am dumb about this stuff, and so I'm going to look for you to inform me on this stuff. So Bitcoin is, in theory, a way to decentralize currency so that no one entity can control it, right? Is that the basic of it?
Yeah, I think there's inherent risk to any currency tied to the government that is responsible for managing that currency. And so, right now, across the globe, for many countries and most of the global economy, it's pegged to the US dollar. And so, unless you have a large enough currency like the euro or the pound or, the yuan or the yen, unless your economy is big enough to have your own currency standards, a lot of international currency is pegged to the US dollar. And so if the US economy goes sideways, has an event that would significantly impact the economy of America, like we did with the '08 crash and the Lehman Brothers crash, let's say you happen to be retiring in that period of time, like your net worth and your wealth was cut in half. Like
Mhm.
you lost so much money because of activities that were outside of your control. And so there's always inherent risk of a currency tied to the government, which with it's backed by. And so that was, I think, one of the big ideas of Bitcoin, right? Was that
Right.
it's not backed by a given government. It's completely a not it's like it's completely agnostic to any institution.
Yeah. So I get that. So I get the negatives of having a centralized currency, right? But isn't there a positive too in that there's a certain level of stability that comes along with a currency like the US dollar, which is a reserve currency, right? And there's a certain level, sure, things could always go sideways, but there's a certain level of stability. And with something like Bitcoin, because it's not regulated, isn't there a certain level of instability and kind of unpredictability in its value? I mean, we've seen, giant swings in the value of Bitcoin, right, over the past decade. So what's the kind of thinking behind putting all your, maybe not all your eggs in one basket, but putting so much weight behind something like Bitcoin?
Sometimes it's when you're so frustrated with options, you look for a reason to believe in an alternative despite the existing options in front of you being the most sound and the most secure. And I think when you've experienced, booms and busts of economy, even within the US. I mean, we've had booms and busts multiple times in our lifetime alone. And I think you look for alternatives in those situations. And I think Bitcoin happened to be right place, right time, given those conditions. But you are 1,000% right on the risks of Bitcoin. There is absolutely nothing fundamentally backing the value of Bitcoin. It is completely fiat. It is completely based off of a open market phenomena of supply and demand. And because of the hunger for an alternative to government backed currencies, you have demand. And as world stability, I think the instability of the world increases. I think the flight to some form of government agnostic currency continues to grow, despite the very point you made. Fundamentally, there is nothing backing the value of Bitcoin. Anybody at any given time, if you have whales that own a large amount of this Bitcoin, can try to cash out and completely collapse the value of Bitcoin.
Well, that was the
So
one
there's a
thing
big
kinda
risk.
yeah, that was the one thing kinda hanging over everything in the documentary, right, was if this Satoshi is real and he supposedly owns 1,000,000 Bitcoin, right? Oh, no, yeah, 1,000,000 Bitcoin,
Yep.
something like that. And if the theorists are right and that Bitcoin will eventually hit $1,000,000, that is $1,000,000,000,000 of value, and he could come and drop that into the market and just obliterate it, right? Like, potentially. Isn't that the fear, part of the fear?
That is part of the fear, and I think if I get the underpinnings of why, like how the cryptocurrency sort of process works, is like you need somebody to create a market. You need there to be some level of liquidity in order for people to exchange and trade coins and add value to it and to create that supply and demand. And so that's why the first million Bitcoin were assigned to Satoshi as sort of the person to create the liquidity that then allows for there to be interest and demand for folks to then try and mine more. If there was never anything in circulation, there was no way to reward miners, no way to encourage people to create a market around Bitcoin, then you would have a very hard time for it to pick up the momentum to create the demand that they wanted to create, or for any currency to create, that you create a market off of it. So that was why you kind of needed to have that seed. And now it's of course all based off of mining, where you try to create a mathematical, you need to just throw a series of hashes together and see if they match with the with a coin that you can be that. And of course, you've got coins that get delivered when you verify transactions, and as you trade crypto, you need um, uh, the blockchain sort of ledger to be continued to be reviewed by other members, and those folks get rewarded by coins as well. So you've created a market around this, and you've created an infrastructure that allows for the exchange, the purchase, the sale of Bitcoin through this blockchain ledger that is the foundation for most of crypto.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I thought one of the interesting technical points that came up during the documentary was this 21,000,000 coin total limit, right? So that's the maximum amount of coins that there could ever be, supposedly. But
Yep.
then one of the big rifts that happened, or one of the, I guess, first big rifts that happened in Bitcoin was this block size limit, where because the block sizes are so small, it limits how fast transactions can happen because it basically creates a queue because the block sizes are so small that if you try to use it for everyday purchases, and this happened, right, where people started using it for everyday purchases, that there's a long queue of transactions, and transactions could take day or hours or days to close, right? So some of the people in Bitcoin propose that they increase the block size limit, right, to make it larger blocks, and that could potentially lead to one day changing the total amount of coins. They could go from 21,000,000 coins to, let's say, 100,000,000 coins, right? That was what was posited in the documentary. So my question is, who is deciding these things? Is there like supposedly there's no central authority, right? Because this is all supposed to be decentralized. So who are these people that are deciding this, and why do they have the authority to do this? And then doesn't that kind of take away from the decentralization aspect of Bitcoin if things can be changed like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. My understanding is it's similar to how I think shareholders vote for like board members of a publicly traded company. I think those individuals that have large stakes of Bitcoin, they get to have voting power over these rules that everybody that owns Bitcoin would abide by. And I guess I don't know whether they do it through amendments to the white paper or whatnot, but I know that they do, put out polls and questions that then get circulated amongst those Bitcoin holders, and they get to vote, I think, relative to the weight of Bitcoins that they hold on the policies and the rules that they want to put into the management of Bitcoin, including things like what you were referencing of the blockchain size. And how the ledger is, like, for each transaction, how the ledger is reviewed to ensure that each transaction is legitimate, not fraudulent, and keep the entire, permanent ledger active. Which, of course, like you said, adds cost because now each transaction does need to, gets more complicated to be reviewed, and takes more energy to review each of the transactions. But that's the beauty, as well as in the case of Bitcoin, one of the challenges of it being one of the first cryptocurrencies that reached the scale that it reached. And a lot of other cryptocurrencies like Ethereum, they don't have the limitation of the 21 million Bitcoin. And again, that's another pro and a con that we can get into. Yeah, that's my understanding. It's usually this voting board of folks that own the Bitcoin that get to decide and create the governance and the rules behind how it's managed.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so let's get into the Ethereum and the kind of like the altcoins, right? So I guess because of some of the limitations like we talked about for Bitcoin, these other technologies came out, right? That were based kind of like the same basis as Bitcoin, but I don't truly understand what the differences are. I guess that they're based on newer technology. Like Ethereum, I like in the documentary they called it the Scambrian explosion. After Ethereum came out, all these kind of meme coins and what they call shit coins came out, and people made a lot of money on it, but also lost a lot of money on it. So, can you explain Ethereum and how it differs from something like Bitcoin?
Yeah, Bitcoin really is like a rare resource. It's mined, it has a finite supply. You could almost think of it as digital gold. That's why those analogies around mining and scarcity work so well. But Ethereum, well, it's different. It's different in how the transactions are validated and in the whole ecosystem that it supports. Yeah, like you said, yeah, like digital gold versus something much more dynamic. Exactly. Ethereum's network enables things like meme coins and decentralized apps and smart contracts. It's not just a currency, it truly is like a platform. And you've also got features like staking and like high yield savings accounts and essentially ways to treat it almost like a whole financial system. One of the core differences as well is that Ethereum doesn't have a capped supply. There's no maximum number of coins, and the validation mechanism is also different. Bitcoin uses a proof of work where miners solve complex puzzles to validate these transactions. Ethereum, on the other hand, uses proof of stake. And in that system, validations are chosen based on how much Ethereum they've staked as collateral. So, say if I stake like 5 Ethereum, that act like basically a security deposit, and I could be chosen to validate transactions and earn rewards. So, like staking also plays into decentralized finance or DeFi, where you can lend your staked Ethereum and earn yield, kind of like interest on a savings account. And then you can use those assets to buy other tokens, invest, and so on. Very similar to what we do with our savings accounts that we put into a bank, right? The bank takes that money and then uses it for their lending purposes and then earns a higher yield on what they lend out than the interest that they pay us when we deposit in our savings accounts. The same holds true within within the world of crypto and staking as well. Um,
But look, going back to, would you liken the kind of, maybe not shift, but the kind of the how Ethereum came off of Bitcoin? Would you liken that to when the dollar came off the gold standard and became a reserve currency? Is that kind of a similar transition, would you say?
I don't think so, because both of them have no, like, none of these coins have any underlying asset ever that gives them value. Like, there's nothing. Like, even at least within the stock market, you have the underlying corporate assets that create some data points that assign value to the shares that are being publicly traded. So there's some rational, you know, like arbitrage that says, I would rather invest my money in this asset because I believe this asset's going to grow over time. Like, there's at least some physical business, commercial business that's producing something that it has a value to it. Literally in any of these cryptos, like there's nothing that's being produced that adds value to it. Like people can
Right.
say they're mining it and they're putting energy in it to solve this algorithm, and that's where the value is coming from. I've heard that as well. But at the end of the day, that value is purely at risk that someone thinks it's important for you to create this digital coin. So no question, you're putting effort, you're mining, you're doing all this work, spending all this energy, but like if nobody cares about you doing all that work, there's still no value to it. There's no yield to it.
Right.
There's no engine. There's no financial engine that says, okay, as a result of this, I'm going to produce this. That's going to be a good that somebody's going to purchase and use. Like all of it is fiat. Like
Right.
all of crypto is fiat. So I don't know. I mean, there is something about the constraint shack of like 21 million that does add like a guardrail to the Bitcoin versus the others, but it's all fiat.
Right. Gotcha. So I guess that goes to the bigger question, right? Of what's the end game? Is the end game? I see it in two different ways in my mind. I see all these guys who either started Bitcoin or got in super early, and it's in their best interest to hype up Bitcoin so that it hits a million and they can either cash out or they become ultra wealthy, right? Like the other part of it is, well, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. They have this utopian dream of having a decentralized currency not controlled by any government or large entity, and it becomes our standard currency. So is the end game that it becomes our currency? But if that's the case, let's say that's the case, right? Kind of stick with my train of thought here. If that's the end game, and we get to that point, and where a mom and pop shop can accept Bitcoin as currency to pay for groceries, let's say, right? Will any cryptocurrency be stable enough to be reliable enough for someone like that running a mom and pop shop to accept Bitcoin as currency? And my question goes further than that. They talk in the documentary about this thing called BCs, which is central bank digital currencies, which essentially, if you think about it, it kind of full circle, right? Where you're back to a digital dollar essentially. And I think it kind of stable coins come into that in a little bit. I'm not fully sure how all that works, but aren't we just back to the same thing that we had with our regular currency? If that's the end game, and we go to these CBDCs, aren't we just back to what we have now?
I think you would be. Let's go back. Let's go back to your first question of
Yeah.
what is the end game, right? I don't think any of these crypto creators have any idea what the end game is. I think the folks that created Bitcoin fucked around and found out that they did something that like has a lot of interest now because of their original thesis however long ago. They got very lucky, I think, in terms of timing and what happened with Silk Road, that they actually found a phenomenal use case, phenomenal, whatever, right? Like in terms of their growth, phenomenal, not moral,
Sure. Yeah.
phenomenal, right?
Right. Yeah.
In terms of the success and the proliferation of Bitcoin in this untraceable, anonymous purchasing of drugs and weapons and, illicit material that you want to have zero trace of you purchasing. And it was like right place, right time, Silk Road, Bitcoin, boom. And that was what really, I think, put Bitcoin on the map, and it really drove its wider spread usage. And now all of the money that I think was in, quote unquote black markets now was moving away from those black markets and shifting over to the Silk Road. And you had, I think, Bitcoin go up in value, and then the emergence of crypto, and then you had all the copycats say, hey, like the barriers to entry to create crypto are small. Anybody can create a meme coin, as evidenced
Yep.
by, Shibu and Doge and all the popular ones that have come out since then. And so I think the end game for crypto is regulations. And I think that governments are still trying to figure out how they want to play this chess game with the masses that are, creating crypto. And I think that there is going to have to be more pain, and people are likely to lose significant money in crypto before there's enough societal pressure for governments to intervene. I think that it's very much the wild, wild west. I think there are a lot of bad actors that are making a quick buck from a moral and ethical standpoint.
Yep.
And in terms of the end game, I mean, I see where you're going with your questions. And I have a feeling that is probably where the government policies will end up pushing crypto towards, is to basically have the digital currency associated with your government again. It's just
Right.
another channel through which that your digital currency will still be pegged to the US dollar, for example,
Right.
which exists now, right? We have USDC. I mean, you have that as a stable coin, which is used to go from fiat currency to the digital currency of, dollars to Ethereum. So when you buy, right, like if you want to go buy Bitcoin or if you want to go buy Ethereum, You can go to Coinbase or whatever, MetaMask and whatever, and purchase these assets. But in order for you to take your, Bank of America, Chase Bank US dollars, you typically convert them into a USDC or some other stable coin, and then you use your USDC to purchase Ethereum or Bitcoin. So typically you're going to convert it into some type of a stable coin as like your initial purchase into the digital currency world, as opposed to going straight from like Chase Bank to Ethereum. You need an
Right, right.
intermediary currency to make that transaction. So anyway, yeah, I think the end game might be a more so where you're going, Chirag, is like the governments will it'll be in the government's best interest to basically navigate crypto back towards being pegged to their government currency.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting. One of the naysayers, Bitcoin or crypto naysayers in the documentary, I forgot his name, but he had an interesting quote where he said, "Many of these utopian movements get started by idealists, but then they get captured by greedy people, and they become a cult, and then they just disappear." So yeah, I think if it were to survive, I think you're right. I think it would have to become some sort of stable currency that's regulated by the government, and then I mean, there are certain advantages to that, right? Where we move away from printed money and go to digital currency. But yeah, I mean, it was interesting that the first kind of government-backed CBDC, I mean, they called it a government-backed shitcoin. That was China, right? But they're using it as a tool of surveillance, almost surveillance and tracking. And so you could see it going that way too, where it kind of defeats the purpose of crypto. But yeah, it's just really interesting how these kind of controls, if you look at it theoretically, these controls that are in our currency will find their way back in, because as long as you have governments and these large corporations and large banks, they're going to find a way to get their paws on it, right? And they'll put the controls back on whatever it is.
I mean, I think when you look in the long run of how do you invest your money, I think folks are okay with a nominal percentage of their portfolio being in risky assets. So you'll always have the tulips of the world, and you'll always have the snake oil salesmen of the world, and arguably, you know I would say crypto started off in that world, and they've gained a ridiculous amount of momentum, and including yours truly. Like I've put some of my investment portfolio into crypto,
Yeah.
and I know it has significant risk, so I don't put a lot. I put a few percentage of my portfolio into it to dabble, to play around, to understand it. But at the end of the day, I wouldn't put a significant part of my savings in this, because there's nothing backing it. There's so much risk with this being purely value on narrative speculation and artificial demand, versus when I put money in a treasury note, or I put money in my savings account at my bank, or a money market account. It's insured. Like, even if Chase or TD were to go bankrupt, it's still backed by the US government, right? Like the Federal
Right.
Deposit Insurance, right? So I have confidence that, I will not lose my money in all of these assets that I put that are backed by the government. Now, stock market, different story. But again, within stock market, I have confidence that Apple is going to be around, that Amazon's going to be around, that
Yep.
these large companies are going to be around for a while, which is why there's confidence that the value isn't going to disappear over a short period of time. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think you're right. I mean, look, it's beneficial to society, it's beneficial to investors to have some level of regulation that's logical, that's common sense that protects the average investor. Like, I don't think an average investor should be in crypto right now. Like, you need to know what you're doing.
Right.
You can get housed, you can lose so much money because it's all I don't know, it's all speculation.
Yeah. So do you think you're right? I think the average investor shouldn't be in crypto. But at a certain point, does it become too late to get in on crypto, right? Because, or is it already too late? If you think about everyone that got in early, and this goes to kind of like the next part of the discussion that I want to talk about is kind of the ethics of crypto, right? So if the idea is to have a decentralized currency to democratize however you say that word, currency, make it more equitable for
Yeah.
people. At this point, you still have a small percentage of people who got in on crypto early, who are going to be, you know, massively wealthy, And there's still going to be this giant, like, the average investor is not going to be in crypto, to your point, and maybe they'll get in at some point, but at that point, a lot of people are going to have a lot of crypto that's going to be worth a lot of money. So doesn't that create the same kind of inequality that we see now with our current currency? Or maybe that's not the point
Yeah.
of the crypto. Maybe that just will always exist. But I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no question. I mean, I think the original, consortium of folks that created Bitcoin, I think saw that as the fundamental opportunity when they first launched Bitcoin, was that they didn't need to hold a lot of it, that they could create a large amount of liquidity, hold a core amount, and if this thing took off, they're all gonna have generational wealth, and however long its popularity lasts, maybe forever.
Mm,
And I think from a moral and an ethical standpoint, you bring up the right question of, well, is that fair? Should they give that back? Should they How should they distribute that? Is it okay for a small group of people to hold that much wealth for this currency that is now, I mean, I would say it's the default cryptocurrency of all the current wave of cryptocurrency is Bitcoin and Ethereum. Those are the two most popular cryptocurrencies in the market, and Bitcoin, I think, being the largest by market cap. So, you know, I don't believe that they have a moral or an ethical obligation to distribute or share what they've created. I think what they do have a moral, ethical obligation to ensure is that if there are bad actors that are taking advantage of Bitcoin in questionable ways, I think they do have an obligation. So, for example, like if we go back to the Silk Road example, like, I don't know, I feel like if they were the default currency for that type of transaction, they have a moral and ethical obligation to say, like, that's not what this was for. Like, this is illicit behavior. This should not be what we unlock with this cryptocurrency. It's not good for society, it's not good for people, and they didn't. I mean, that kind of shows you where on, like, to me, that's an indicator of the moral, motivations behind the creation of crypto. I don't think it was this altruistic, like, anti-government, like, movement. I think it was much more a grift. I mean, that's that's my that's my bias, that this was a way in which they were going to make wealth for themselves, and they knew the risks, and I think they hedged against them through the whole creation of what we talked about earlier.
yeah.
But how do we get more fair, equitable distribution of crypto? I think there should be some level of insurance of money that you do stake, if you will, in, like, your savings account. I think Bitcoin, if you want folks to create, more liquidity, and, I know you've only got 21 million coins, but if you want to give folks a safe place to say, okay, we'll back your, Bitcoin up to whatever X dollars if you put it into this savings account. Like, I think there should be some level of insurance that the whales of Bitcoin can provide, so that they have skin in the game to keep this currency around for the long run. And you do that through insurance and through building confidence, and reducing the downside risk of folks that are, joining your currency. So that's one idea that I just thought of in this. But I think
Yeah.
that's what regulations have to get involved with, is you have to put some floor on your losses. It used to be, what, 100K in savings accounts in our US banks. I think it went up to like 2K. So you
Right.
need something like that. Like, if you're going to stake some money, then you should have some level of insurance on those funds.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would suggesting redistribution necessarily, but yeah, I mean, I think that is a good idea. I think through the regulations that will eventually emerge, I think there have to be some safeguards in place, right? Where once the average Joe Schmo starts getting involved in crypto, that there is some stability there and some kind of reliability.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's gonna, I think, add to its value, to be honest. I mean, what did they called it? They called something in the documentary where it gets into, like, Bitcoinflation or something like that, coinflation, where it just goes into this hyper, inflationary loop where the value is going to, like, really jump very quickly. And I think if you have some other mechanisms to create confidence in the currency, then I think that creates the right environment for that type of activity to occur. I mean, it's so fascinating to me to even talk about this and watch this because it's easy to make arguments on both sides. It's easy to
Yeah.
make arguments on the hyperflation side, and it's easy to make arguments that say this thing is going to go to zero.
Right.
It's insane. It really makes your mind, mind kind of crazy.
Yeah. And it kind of, it's almost feels like an inflection point, right? Where I remember when I was reading Nexus by Yuval Noah Harari, and he talks about when our monetary systems first developed, thousands of years ago. And it was essentially when people agreed that, hey, I'm going to give you these five sheep and you're going to give me this paper or coins or whatever it was, right? And the only thing that gave those coins value is that both parties agreed that those coins held value. I mean, essentially, that's all monetary. That's our whole financial system, right? It's something that's only valuable if everyone agrees that it's valuable. So I could see where we get to a point where everyone just agrees that Bitcoin is the currency. And, yeah, we could get there with the right regulations and, but yeah, I'm not really sure where I was going with that. But yeah, but this feels like a similar inflection point where it could shift towards this cryptocurrency. The technology is there, and if enough people come on board, then that could just be our new currency. So I could see that happening for
Yeah.
sure.
No, it's true, man. And the fascinating thing about this whole, like, okay, $1 million, valuation that I think some of the Bitcoin bulls have publicly and, claim that they think it's going to go to. I mean, like, so if there's 21 million coins and each one is worth $1 million, that's a 21
Trillion,
trillion
right?
dollar trillion dollar market cap, right?
Yep.
Like, that's the freaking US economy. Like, it's bigger than the US economy. Like, that
Right.
just is that's mind-numbing to think that
Mm,
you would have a currency that we've all invested money in that has created a valuation that's bigger than the US economy. I mean, it's possible. I mean, you get, like, around the world, sure, like, it's possible, but it just, I don't know, like, I don't see it happening. Like, I'm very skeptical of it getting up to $1 million, but I mean, shit, you never know. I mean, you really never know. I mean, crazier things have happened in history, and the like, humans are sheepish, right? Like, humans are like, people follow a crowd, and if they believe that there's money to be made, it's like we talked about in the discussion here. Like, it's still early. The average person is not investing in this. If the
right.
average person is now gaining accessibility and they want to throw a few bucks in here, sure, demand could certainly, get a lot bigger.
Yeah. So where do we go from here? Is Bitcoin? What do you think? Bitcoin going to a million or is it going to zero?
Oh man, it's probably right somewhere in the middle is
Yeah.
definitely, the answer from my book. Like, there's so much institutional investment. Dude, pension funds are now having workarounds and how they invest in Bitcoin. They're not
Wow.
buying it directly, but they're buying companies that are buying, Bitcoin, like, what was the name of that company? Not computer, so was it Computer Associates? Anyway, one of those
Maybe.
companies that has more valuation in the Bitcoin that they own than they do in their own operating model. So I think it's here. I think it's here for a while. I think it's here to stay. I think Bitcoin will be around for a while. I think it has a lot of liquidity from the work that it had done on Silk Road. I think those
Right.
transactions still happen somewhere, and so I think the currency is still being deployed in that market. So I don't see it going away. I don't see it hitting a million. I think regulations, competition, and just its lack of speed of use are going to be limitations on it, going to a million. But yeah, that's what I mean. It's not going any. I mean, I think crypto's here for the long run,
Yeah.
but I do think, like, the long run, it's going to get more government intervention and get back to a more regulated currency.
Right. Well, thanks for helping me wrap my head around that. I think that the documentary definitely helped a little bit with this conversation, kind of talking it through, really helped wrap my head around what cryptocurrency is. And where we can see it go from here.
Yeah, no question. I mean, the thesis is very interesting fundamentally. I
Yeah.
think that
Hmm.
there is definitely international politics, very high risk of currency fluctuations, very high. I think understanding crypto is important. I think we should continue to learn and see where it might fit into our individual risk profile to dabble a bit, see where it goes. I think it'll be fun to keep track of and see what happens from here. And who knows, maybe we'll create a question everything coin one day.
Another shit coin to add to the heap, right?
And everything, including this cryptocurrency. How about that? That'll be
Right,
our
right,
tagline.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's right. That's right. That's good.
Oh my gosh, man. Well,
All right,
hey,
man. This was fun. Yeah,
I,
this was.
this was a good one.
Yep.
I'll wrap with like a quick tale. Maybe everybody's heard this one before, but have you heard of the Dutch tulip mania? Like this was what I was referring to before. That this was like one of the first like I don't know. Remember learning about it in business school, where it was like one of the first financial bubbles back in the 1600s. It was about the irrationality of and the creation of bubbles in markets. So tulips were introduced into the Netherlands from Turkey in the late 1500s, and it became this like symbol of wealth due to their exotic nature and how beautiful they were.
Huh.
And then by the mid 1600s, like tulips had become so fashionable amongst the middle class, and the rare varieties with unique color patterns basically, were even more valuable, right? So everybody was trying to get access and buy these rare, crazy, beautiful tulips. And the rarer they were, the more valuable they were. So essentially, a futures market developed where contracts for tulips were being bought and sold before the actual harvest. So this allowed for like one of the first markets, like kind of like what we do with like on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, like we
Right,
saw
right.
contracts on goods, right? Like, this happened literally for tulips. And because of this increased access to tulips before they were physically made, it created a um, hyperinflation of the value of tulips. And so
Wow.
now, if it was like, uh, 10 cents a tulip, they were being sold for $1 a tulip. And so, like, reportedly, they were being sold for like just 10 times what like an average income was in that time frame. And in the I guess like a few years later, like after all these like crazy contracts were being pushed out, like the farmers weren't able to produce and live up to the demands that were out there, and the contracts were oversold on what supply was actually available. And
Wow.
there was all these defaults on the contracts, and so once the contract started defaulting, the prices collapsed like overnight. And many of these investors that had bought all these contracts and put their life savings into them, they were all wiped out. So when you hear stories of like artificial markets being created on hype and creating liquidity through these contracts of something that doesn't really exist yet, and you're leveraging those through these
Mm.
contracts to create money, you create hype, and eventually when you can't meet the demands of a contract, the bubble bursts, and unfortunately it has a graveyard of financial losses behind it. So anyway, I shared that as a if you haven't heard that one
Yeah,
before,
no,
now you
that's
know that
no, I
on the
haven't
tulip
actually I didn't
story.
hear about that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's really super interesting. Actually, it's funny. It reminds me of this Buddhist concept, right? Of the middle way, where you don't like just moderation is key, right? Where you don't put all your eggs into, it's like the classic saying, you don't put all your eggs in one basket. It's like, don't be so extreme in what you invest in, right? Like, be diversified. And, it's like the classic investing advice is diversify your assets. And I think it holds true, right? Like, yeah, maybe you throw a little money into crypto, but I mean, would you throw your life savings into crypto? Absolutely not, right? And I think it'd be foolish to do so. But yeah, I mean, it's another way to kind of diversify where your money is. So yeah, why not?
Yeah. Yeah, no question, no question. Like you said, I think it is all about balance and risk tolerance, and like you said, each person's levels are different. So
Yeah,
to each their
very
own. What
true.
you believe moderation is, but well, this was fun, man.
Yeah,
Always good to chat, and we'll keep it going.
yeah, sounds good. I think that's the pod.
All right, that's it. That's the pod. We'll catch you next time.
Catch you next time.